There are moments in history when the truth does not simply fade. It gets buried. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes violently, and sometimes so completely that future generations are left with nothing but fragments. Pieces of a puzzle scattered across manuscripts, legends, and maps that no longer exist. But every once in a while, one of these fragments rises to the surface. In the year 1357, a manuscript appeared in Europe. It carried no royal seal, no official endorsement, just the words of a solitary traveler, a knight, Sir John Mandeville. On its surface, it looked like a medieval travelogue, a story of distant lands, exotic peoples, mythical creatures. But hidden within its pages was something far more dangerous. A description of a world that should not exist. A world that contradicts everything we have been taught. A world ruled not by scattered kingdoms, but by a colossal empire so powerful, so wealthy, and so technologically superior that the kings of Europe looked like village chiefs in comparison. And then, as if by magic, as if by design, this empire disappeared. No ruins, no chronicles, no memory. This is the story of that empire, the forgotten civilization that was deleted from history, and the medieval traveler who saw it all with his own eyes. A manuscript that should not exist. When Sir John Mandeville sat down to record his travels, he didn't write like a dreamer or a poet. He wrote like a man preparing a report. He noted geography, distances, customs, trade routes, political systems, economic structures. He wrote like someone documenting a world that was familiar to him, not fantastical. And that alone is a problem, because the world he describes is not the world we learn about in school. He speaks of mountains that shift and close, creatures that modern science calls mythical, islands of giants, fountains that heal, nations locked away by the hand of Alexander the Great himself. These details seem outrageous until you notice the one thing that sets Mandeville apart. He was not telling stories. He was giving testimony. He was describing a world in which the supernatural was simply natural, a world in which boundaries between the mythological and the historical had not yet hardened. And then, his manuscript takes a turn, because his greatest revelation was not about monsters, miracles, or marvels. It was about an empire, a real one, a vast one, and one that is missing from every modern historical map. The world beyond the maps. Before the Renaissance, before the printing press standardized world knowledge, before universities set rigid boundaries around what was real and what was impossible, the world was understood not as a collection of fixed territories, but as a living place, a place that breathed, shifted, expanded, contracted. And in this world existed lands we no longer remember. Mandeville describes regions with their own laws of nature, not because he was delusional, but because his entire worldview was formed in a time before the world was flattened by science. His descriptions are precise, even clinical. He gives distances, landmarks, local names, political hierarchies, economies. And then, finally, he arrives at the center of everything. A land that was not mythological, not supernatural, but undeniably real. A land called Cath. But according to Mandeville, Cath was not China. In fact, he specifically states that China lies to the east of Cath. So what was Cath? And why does its name appear across dozens of medieval maps only to vanish completely by the 18th century? Because Cath was not merely a region. It was the capital of a far greater dominion, a world empire known as Tartary, entering the heart of a lost empire. To understand why this is so important, we need to explore what Mandeville actually witnessed. He did not simply pass through Tartary. He served there. He and his men became soldiers in the army of the great Khan, fighting for 15 months in a war against a king known as Mani. This single line, hidden deep within his manuscript, is one of the most explosive lines in medieval literature, because it establishes that Mandeville did not rely on rumors. He lived inside this empire. He observed it from the inside, and what he describes is staggering. The palace of the great Khan was larger than most medieval cities. Its walls stretched for over 2 leagues, an impossible size for the era. Its halls had floors poured from solid gold. Gold and silver were not currency here. They were building materials. The empire used leather money, a fully state-controlled currency system that Europe would not even conceptualize until centuries later. This wasn't a primitive nomadic confederation. This was a centralized, bureaucratic, industrial powerhouse. Its capital, Cath, was the hub of global trade. Merchants from every continent traveled there for silk, spices, gems, and metals. Its armies were massive. Its administration was sophisticated. Its engineering was unmatched. This was not a footnote in history. This was one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen. So why is it not in any textbook? The erased continent. Maps from the Middle Ages and early Renaissance show something shocking. A massive territory covering what is now Russia, Mongolia, Siberia, parts of China, and Central Asia, labeled boldly as Great Tartary. This label appeared consistently for centuries. Travelers wrote about it, merchants visited it, missionaries reported from within it, diplomats negotiated with its rulers. It was, by all accounts, one of the largest empires ever to exist. And then, between the 17th and 18th centuries, it disappears from maps. Not shrinks, not collapses, vanishes, replaced with vague territorial names, fragmented, broken, erased. Western historians began referring to Tartary not as an empire, but as a mistaken medieval idea, a cartographic error, a fantasy. But how does an empire that ruled half of the known world become a mistake? How does a civilization described by dozens of travelers, documented across multiple cultures, simply evaporate? The answer is uncomfortable, because it wasn't an accident. It was policy. Why the West needed to delete an empire. Imagine Europe in the 14th century, a continent torn by disease, war, famine, and internal strife. Kings fought for scraps of territory. Nobles struggled for power. Common people lived short, brutal lives. And yet, far to the east, there existed a civilization that dwarfed Europe in every aspect. Wealth, population, territory, technology, trade, centralization, and military strength. This was a threat, not militarily, but ideologically. If Europe acknowledged that a stronger, more advanced civilization existed elsewhere, its claim to global supremacy would crumble. And so, after the fall of Tartary, whatever the cause might have been, the victors rewrote the story. They took the wealth, the inventions, the technologies, and redistributed the credit across European nations. They burned archives, confiscated manuscripts, destroyed maps, reassigned place names, and perhaps most effectively, they replaced the name Cath with China, redirecting any future research down a path that would lead to nowhere. A perfect historical smokescreen. What destroyed Tartary? If such a massive empire existed, what could possibly have destroyed it?
Mandeville's manuscript offers clues. He mentions catastrophic floods. He describes entire regions buried under layers of earth. He references monstrous wars, conflicts so large they echo the legends of gods battling across the heavens. He notes that the Great Khan's empire was feared by European rulers because it represented an alternative world order. Taken together, these hints suggest two possibilities. 1. A global natural cataclysm, perhaps an event so devastating, a flood, massive earthquakes, or widespread fires, that entire cities were swallowed. 2. A global war hidden from modern history, a conflict so large and destructive that the victors had every reason to erase it entirely. Or both, a war that triggered a cataclysm that made the war unwinnable, and a power vacuum that allowed new empires, Russia, China, the British Empire, to rewrite history in their own favor. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. A civilization was deleted. The Gog and Magog connection. One of the strangest stories Mandeville recounts involves 10 Jewish tribes, the infamous Gog and Magog, locked away behind closing mountains. On the surface, this sounds mythological, but geographically, his description is specific. He points directly to a region near the Caspian Mountains. He notes a single guarded pass, a queen of the Amazons, a sealed country containing millions of people. This is not myth. This is quarantine, a global containment. Why would medieval rulers quarantine entire populations? What threat did they pose? What did they know? What did they witness? And why does this region, now heavily closed off, heavily militarized, remain one of the least explored places on Earth? These questions linger, and they lead back, inevitably, to Tartary. What medieval travelers really saw. Mandeville was not alone. Dozens of travelers from the 12th to the 16th centuries described the same things. A massive northern empire, cities of gold, advanced infrastructure, giant palaces, state-issued banknotes, unimaginably wealthy trade centers, a ruler whose influence stretched across continents. Different authors, different backgrounds, different eras, yet the same story. Which means one thing. They all saw something real, something powerful, something world-shaping, something worth erasing. Why this matters today? If an entire civilization, one of the largest in human history, could be wiped from the record, what else could be missing? What technologies, what philosophies, what political systems, what alternative paths of human development? How many manuscripts remain hidden in private libraries, sealed archives, restricted collections? How many truths lie buried under new cities, rewritten by new empires, and forgotten by new generations? The story of Tartary is not just history. It is a warning, A reminder that the winners do not simply write history, they design it, they sculpt it, they censor it, they delete whatever threatens their narrative, and they leave us, not with truth, but with a curated version of truth, a version that serves their interests. The final revelation. When Sir John Mandeville wrote his manuscript, he wasn't trying to start a revolution. He wasn't trying to expose a conspiracy. He was simply recording what he saw. But in doing so, he preserved the memory of a world that someone wanted us to forget. An empire that once stood at the center of global power. A civilization that rivaled and perhaps surpassed every nation of its time. A world that existed until it didn't. And now we are left with only fragments, scattered words on yellowed pages, clues hidden in plain sight, maps that whisper the truth only to those who know where to look. The forgotten empire is gone, but its shadow remains. And if one empire can be erased so completely, how many more stories are waiting to be rediscovered? How many truths lie buried beneath the fragile surface of our accepted history? Maybe, just maybe, the world is far stranger, far older, and far more interconnected than we have ever been allowed to believe.